Well, good morning to my grandchildren. It's Saturday, and it's our opportunity to read another chapter in our storybook, The Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And Laura is telling about how she grew up back years ago, about 150 years ago, in the woods in Wisconsin, and the little house and what she remembered. And our last chapter we read about they went to town at Pippin, and Laura had picked up a lot of pretty pebbles along the shores of Lake Pippin and put so many in her pocket that her pocket tore. But Ma said she could fix it and everything would be okay. And they had a good day going to town and a good picnic and lots of enjoyment, and got to do something Laura hadn't done before. So this chapter is titled Summertime. And I'll read this chapter and we'll see how summertime went in the little house in the big woods. Well, now it was summertime, and people went visiting in the summertime. Sometimes Uncle Henry or Uncle George or Grandpa came riding out of the big woods to see Pa. Ma would come to the door and ask how all the folks were, and she would say, "Charles is in the clearing." Then she would cook more dinner than usual, and dinner time would last longer. Pa and Ma would sit with the visitor, talking for a little while before they went back to work, and sometimes Ma let Laura and Mary go across the road and down the hill to see Mrs. Peterson. The Petersons had just moved in. Their house was new and always very neat because Mrs. Peterson had no little girls to muss it up. She was a Swede, and she let Laura and Mary look at the pretty things that she had brought from Sweden. There were laces and colored embroideries and china. Mrs. Peterson talked Swedish to them, and they talked English to her, and they understood each other perfectly. She always gave them each a cookie when they left, and then they would nibble on their cookies very slowly while they walked home. Laura nibbled away exactly half of her cookie, and Mary nibbled away exactly half of hers, and the other halves they would save for baby Carrie. Then when they got home, Carrie had two half cookies. Well, that was the whole cookie. This wasn't really right. All they wanted to do was to divide the cookies fairly with Carrie. Still, if Mary saved half of her cookie while Laura ate the whole of hers, or if Laura saved half of her cookie while Mary ate the whole of hers, well, that wouldn't be fair either. They didn't know just exactly what to do, so each one saved half, and they gave it to baby Carrie. But they always felt that somehow it just wasn't quite fair. Sometimes a neighbor sent word that the family was coming to spend the day, and then Ma did extra cleaning and cooking and opened the package of store-bought sugar. On the day set, a wagon would come driving out to the gate in the morning, and there would be strange new children to play with. When Mr. and Mrs. Hewlett came, they brought Eva and Clarence with them. Eva was a pretty girl with dark eyes and black curls. She played carefully and kept her dress all clean and smooth. Mary liked that, but Laura liked it better to play with Clarence. Clarence was red-headed and freckled and always laughing. His clothes were pretty too. He wore a blue suit, buttoned all the way up the front with bright gilt buttons and trimmed with braid, and then he had copper-toed shoes. The strips of copper across the toes were so glittering and so bright that Laura wished she were a boy, because little girls just didn't wear copper-toed shoes. Laura and Clarence ran and shouted and climbed trees, while Mary and Eva walked nicely together and talked. Ma and Miss Hewlett visited for a long time, and they looked at the Goodies Ladies book, which Mrs. Hewlett had brought, and Pa and Mr. Hewlett looked at the horses and the crops and smoked their pipes. Here's a picture of Clarence and Laura out climbing in the trees. Once Aunt Lottie came to spend the day. That morning Laura had to stand still a long while Ma unwound her hair from the cloth rags and combed it into long curls. Mary was all ready, sitting primly on a chair with her golden curls shining in her china blue dress, fresh and crisp. Laura liked her own red dress, but Ma pulled her hair dreadfully when it was brown instead of golden, and no one noticed it at all. Everyone noticed and admired Mary's hair, but Laura's hair was just brown. "There," Ma said at last, "your hair is curled beautifully. Lottie is coming. Run down to meet her, both of you, and ask her which she likes best, brown curls or golden curls." Laura and Mary ran out the door. They ran down the path. Aunt Lottie was already at the gate. Aunt Lottie was a big girl, much taller than Mary. Her dress was beautiful. It was pink, and she was swinging a pink sunbonnet by one string. "Which do you like best, Aunt Lottie?" Mary asked. "Brown curls or golden curls?" Ma had told them to ask that, and Mary was a very good little girl, always did exactly as she was told. Mary waited to hear what Aunt Lottie would say. She felt miserable. "I like both kinds," she said. She took Laura and Mary by the hand, one on either side, and they danced along the path going back to the door where Ma stood. The sunshine came streaming through the windows into the house, and everything was so neat and so pretty. The table was covered with red cloth, and the cook stove was polished, shining black. Through the bedroom door, Laura could see that the trundle bed was already in its place under the big bed, and the pantry door stood wide open, giving the sight and smell of goodies on the shelves. And Black Susan came purring as she came down the stairs from the attic, stretching her long body where she had been taking a nap up in the attic. It was all so pleasant, and Laura felt so gay and so good. Why, no one would have suspected that she could be as naughty as she was that evening. Well, Aunt Lottie had gone, and Laura and Mary were tired, and they were cross. They were at the wood pile, gathering up a pan of chips to kindle the fire in the morning, and they always hated to pick up the chips, but every day they had to do it. Tonight, they hated it even more than ever, and Laura grabbed the biggest chip. Mary said, "I don't care. Aunt Lottie likes my hair best anyways. Golden hair is lots prettier than brown hair." Laura's throat swelled tight. She could not speak. She knew that golden hair was prettier than brown hair, but she just couldn't speak. So she reached out quickly and just slapped Mary's face. Then she heard Pa say, "Come here, Laura." She went slowly, dragging her feet. Pa was sitting just inside the door, and he had seen her slap Mary. "You remember," Pa said, "I told you girls, you must never strike each other." Laura began, but Mary said, "That makes no difference," Pa said. "It is what I say that you must mind." Then he took down a strap from the wall, and he whipped Laura with the strap. Laura sat on a chair in the corner and sobbed. When she stopped sobbing, she sulked. The only thing in the world there was to be glad about was that Mary had to fill the chip pan all by herself. At last, when it was getting dark, Pa said again, "Come over here, Laura." His voice was kind, and when Laura came, he took her on his knee and hugged her close. She sat in the crook of his arm, her head against his shoulder, and his long brown whiskers partly covering her eyes, and everything was all right again. She told Pa all about it, and she asked him, "You don't like golden curls better than brown curls, do you, Pa?" Pa's blue eyes were shining down at her, and he said, "Well, Laura, all my hair is brown." She had not thought about that. Pa's hair was brown. His whiskers were brown. And she thought, well, brown is a lovely color, but she was glad that Mary had to gather up all the chips. In the summer evening, Pa did not tell stories or play the fiddle. Summer days were long, and he was tired after he had worked hard all day in the fields. Ma was busy too. Laura and Mary helped her weed the garden. They helped her feed the calves and the hens. And they gathered the eggs, and they helped make cheese. When the grass was tall and thick in the woods and the cows were giving plenty of milk, that was the time to make cheese. Somebody must kill a calf for cheese. For cheese could not be made without rennet. Rennet is the lining of a young calf's stomach. The calf must be very young, so that it had never eaten anything but milk. Laura was afraid that Pa would have to kill one of the little calves in the barn. They were so sweet. One was fawn-colored and one was red. And their hair was soft, and their large eyes were so wondering. Laura's heart beat fast when Ma talked to Pa about making cheese. Pa would not kill either of his calves because they were little heifers, and heifers would grow into cows. So he went to Grandpa's and to Uncle Henry's to talk about cheese making, and Uncle Henry said he would kill one of his calves, and there would be enough rennet for Aunt Polly and Grandma and Ma, and they'd all three have plenty to do. So Pa went again to Uncle Henry's and came back with a piece of the little calf's stomach. It was like a piece of soft grayish-white leather, all rigid and rough on one side. When the cows were milked at night, Ma set the milk away in pans, and in the morning she skimmed off the cream to make into butter. Then, when the morning's milk had cooled, she mixed it with the skim milk and set it all on the stove to heat. A bit of the rennet, tied in a cloth, was soaking in warm water. When the milk was heated enough, Ma squeezed every drop of water from the rennet in the cloth, and then she poured the water into the milk, and she stirred it well and left it in a warm place by the stove. In a little while, it thickened into a smooth, quivery mass. With a long knife, Ma cut this mass into little squares and let it stand while the curd separated from the whey. Then she poured it all into a cloth and let the thin yellowish whey drain out. When no more whey dripped from the cloth, Ma emptied the curd into a big pan and salted it, turning it and mixing it real well. Well, Laura and Mary were always there, helping all they could. They loved to eat bits of the curd when Ma was salting it. It squeaked in their teeth. Well, under the cherry tree outside the back door, Pa had put up the board to press the cheese on. He had cut 2 grooves the whole length of the board and laid the board on blocks, one end a little higher than the other, and under the lower end stood an empty pail. Ma put her wooden cheese hoop on the board and spread the clean wet cloth all over the inside of it and filled it heaping full with the chunks of salted curd. She covered this with another clean wet cloth and laid on top of it a round board that was cut small enough to go inside of the cheese hoop. Then she lifted the heavy rock and put it on top of the board. Here's a picture of Mary helping her Ma, and the cheese hoop is on the board, and there's grooves in the board, and the bucket's under the end of the board, and Laura is there helping and doing her part to stir up the milk and do what she can to help too. All day long the round board settled slowly under the weight of the rock, and the whey pressed out and ran down the grooves of the board and into the pail. Next morning, Ma would take out the brown yellow cheese as large as a milk pan, and then she made more curd and filled the cheese hoop again. Every morning she took the new cheese out of the press and trimmed it smooth, and she sewed a cloth tightly around it and rubbed the cloth all over with fresh butter. And then she put the cheese on the shelf in the pantry, and every day she wiped every cheese carefully with the wet cloth and rubbed it all over with fresh butter once more. She laid it all down on it, then she laid the cheese down on its other side. After a great many days, the cheese was ripe, and there was a hard rind all over it. Then Ma wrapped each cheese in a paper and laid it away on the high shelf, and there was nothing more to do with it but eat it up. Laura and Mary liked cheese making, and they liked to eat the curd that squeaked in their teeth, and they liked to eat the edges that Ma pared off of the big round yellow cheeses to make them smooth before she sewed them up in cloth. Ma laughed at them for eating green cheese. The moon is made of green cheese, some people say, she told them. The new cheese did not look like the round moon. It did look a little bit like the round moon when it came up behind the trees, but it wasn't green. It was yellow, like the moon. It's green, Ma said, because it isn't ripened yet. When it's cured and ripened, it won't be green cheese anymore. It'll be yellow cheese. Is the moon really made out of green cheese? Laura asked. Ma laughed. I think people say that because it looks like green cheese, she said, but appearances can be deceiving. Then, while she wiped all the green cheeses and rubbed them with butter, she told them all about the dead, cold moon, and like a little world in which nothing grows. The first day Ma made cheese, Laura tasted the whey. She tasted it without saying anything to Ma, and when Ma turned around and saw her face, Ma laughed. That night, while she was washing the supper dishes, Mary and Laura were wiping the dishes, and Ma told Pa Laura had tasted the whey and didn't like it. Well, you wouldn't starve to death on Ma's whey like old Grimes did on his wife's, Pa said. And Laura heard that. She just begged him to tell her all about old Grimes. So, though Pa was tired, he took his fiddle out of its box and played and sang for Laura. Old Grimes is dead, that good old man, we'll ne'er see him no more. He used to wear a old gray coat, all buttoned down before. Old Grimes's wife made skim milk cheese. Old Grimes, he drank the whey. There came an east wind from the west and blew old Grimes away. It blew old Grimes away. Here's a picture of Grimes getting blown away. There you have it, Pa said. She was a mean, tight-fisted woman, and she hadn't skimmed all the milk. A little cream would have run off in the whey, and old Grimes might have staggered along. But she skimmed off every bit of cream, and poor old Grimes got so thin the wind just blew him away, plumb starved to death. Then Pa looked at Ma and said, "Nobody ever starved to death when you're around, Caroline." "Well, no," Ma said. "No, Charles, not if you were there to provide for us." Pa was pleased. It was all so pleasant to hear Pa and Ma talking to each other nice. The doors and windows were wide open in the summer evening, the dishes making the little cheerful sounds together as Ma washed them and Mary and Laura wiped them, and Pa putting away the fiddle and smiling and whistling softly to himself. And after a while he said, "I'm going over to Henry's tomorrow morning, Caroline, to borrow the grubbing hoe. Those sprouts are getting waist high around the stumps in the wheat field, and a man just has to keep everlasting after it, or the woods will take back the place." Early next morning, he started to walk to Uncle Henry's, but before long, here he came hurrying back. He hitched up the horses to the wagon and threw in his axe, and 2 wash tubs, and the wash boiler, and all the pails and wooden buckets that were there. "I don't know if I'll need 'em all," he said to Caroline, "but I'd hate to want 'em and not have 'em." "What is it? What is it?" Laura asked. "What's going on?" She was jumping up and down with excitement. "Pa's found a bee tree," Ma said. "Maybe he'll bring us some honey." It was noon before Pa came driving back home. Laura had been watching for him. She ran out to the wagon as soon as it stopped in the barnyard, but she couldn't see up into it. Pa called, "Caroline, if you'll come and take this pail of honey, I'll go unhitch the horses." Ma came out to the wagon. She looked disappointed. She said, "Well, Charles, even 1 pail of honey is something." Then she looked into the wagon and threw her hands up in the air, and Pa just started laughing. All the pails and all the buckets were heaping full of dripping golden honeycomb. Both tubs were piled clear full, so was the wash boiler, and Pa and Ma went back and forth carrying all the loads. There were 2 loaded tubs, the wash boiler full, and all the buckets and pails they carried into the house. Ma heaped a plate high with golden pieces, all covered all the rest neatly with cloths. For dinner they had as much of the delicious honey as they could possibly eat, and Pa told them how he found the bee tree. "I didn't take my gun that day," he said, "because I wasn't hunting, and now it's summertime. There's not much danger of really finding any trouble. Panthers and bears are so fat this time of year, they're lazy and good-natured. Well, I took a shortcut through the woods, and I nearly ran into a big old bear. I came around a clump of underbrush. There he was, not as far from me as across this room. He looked around at me. I guess he saw I didn't have a gun. Anyway, he didn't pay no mind to me at all. He was standing at the foot of a big tree. Bees were buzzing all around him. They couldn't sting through his thick fur, and he kept brushing them away from his head with one paw, and I stood there watching him. He put the other paw into a hole in the tree and drew it out all dripping with honey. He licked the honey off his paw and reached in for some more, but by that time I had found me a club. I wanted that honey for myself. Here's a picture of the bear at the tree. So I made a big racket, banging the club against a tree and yelling, and the bear was so fat and so full of honey that he just dropped on all fours and waddled off among the trees. I chased him some distance and got him to going a little faster. He was headed away from the bee tree, and then I came back for the wagon. Laura asked him, "Well, how did you get the honey away from the bees?" "That was easy," Pa said. "I left the horses back in the woods where they wouldn't get stung. Then I chopped the tree down and split it open." "Well, didn't the bees sting you?" "No," Pa says. "Bees never sting me." The whole tree was hollow and filled from top to bottom with honey. The bees must have been storing away honey there for years. Some of it was old and dark, but I guess I got enough good clean honey to last us for a long time. Laura was sorry for the poor bees. She said, "They worked so hard and now they won't have any honey." But Pa said there was lots of honey left for the bees, and there was another large hollow tree nearby into which they could move. He said it was time they had a clean new home anyway. They would take the old honey that he had left in the old tree and make it into fresh new honey and store it away in their new house, and they would save every drop of the spilled honey and put it away, and they would have plenty of honey again long before winter came. So that's the chapter on summertime, and I hope you kids enjoyed listening to the story, The Little House in the Big Wood, and my opportunity to say to you, I love you very much. I hope you kids get to go back to church and Sunday school again real soon. I get to start preaching again at Union Church Sunday night. We won't be going to church on Sunday morning because we're still not allowed to take any of the kids off campus. But we're on days off this time, so we get to go and be with a few of the people that we miss and we want to be with at church. And I hope you get to go see some people that you love and you care about too real soon. I hope this coronavirus goes away and we're able to find a vaccine or a cure, and we're able to start visiting each other again soon. I love you. Take care. Grandpa loves you very much. Bye.